So often, those people who've experienced a fair amount of trauma will feel really discouraged by the kind of advice they get, or sometimes the therapy treatments or the videos that they watch, because the tools and techniques that are shared for emotional regulation seem almost irrelevant. At best, like way too simple, but probably irrelevant because people who have strong trauma responses feel like the traumatic response hits out of the blue, could come from nowhere. It's overwhelmingly strong. They don't feel like it was caused by a thought or a particular way of thinking, and it feels out of control and overwhelming. So, I want to talk today about how trauma does cause emotional dysregulation. Almost by its definition, it causes emotional dysregulation. And I'd like to explain what happens in our body and our mind when we go through trauma, what actually is physically happening, and how the memories are stored differently in a way that it can impact emotional dysregulation forever until you can heal, process the traumas, resolve the traumas. And I do also want to share the hope that it is possible to do this. And I want to talk about how to adapt some of those typical suggestions for yourself if you've had a significant amount of trauma. So, a traumatic event is one in which a person is threatened physically, emotionally, or spiritually in a way where it is a survival threat. And it may not be a complete physical survival threat, but it could be a threat to personhood. And particularly for children who are developing their sense of self, and their sense of self is very tied to their caregivers. So, neglect, emotional abuse can have very long-standing impact. So not all trauma is major physical abuse or war or actually being exposed to somebody who dies, which is how it used to be defined. But now the definition is definitely broader. And you can hear in the definition I'm using that it is a situation that causes the person to be emotionally overwhelmed. It is beyond their ability to cope with. So the experience is one of severe emotional dysregulation, which is tied to the situation, makes perfect sense, but it also causes then ongoing emotional dysregulation. But what happens during a traumatic event is that your adrenaline floods your system, right? Which enables you to run, fight, or freeze, and then cortisol kicks in. And the cortisol actually shuts down your hippocampus in a way that the memory of that event doesn't move into long term storage. The memory of that event stays in the emotional brain. And actually, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking that kind of makes sense if you think about caveman times when we lived in a world where physical survival was always a question, like having these things that threaten our physical survival stay in that emotional brain in the immediacy and intensity of the emotional brain makes sense, right? But anyway, that is what happens. And that's why traumatic memories feel very different than other memories. And the other thing about the traumatic memories is that they're stored often, not always, but often in fragments of a smell or a sound. They don't always have a full story that goes with them. So the traumatic event is embedded in your emotional memory where sensory information is tied to a physiological response. Now, this is what has real implications for us on an ongoing basis in terms of emotional regulation. And another key here is that our limbic system, our emotional brain, does not have a sense of time. So these memories are stored in a way where there's no linear sense of time. There's no sense of like, oh yeah, that was 40 years ago. Time is a concept that's understood by the cognitive parts of our brain, the frontal lobe, the language centers. So, when these sensory fragments are triggered, your body responds as if that event was happening now. So, I'm going to share some graphics here that I think will help you understand these concepts a little bit more clearly. But basically, intense experiences will link the sensory information of what's happening to the emotional response. And this is what becomes a trigger. Now, these triggers can be positive or negative. So, if there's a smell that reminds you of your grandmother who was a positive figure in your life and comforting, then that smell might bring up those feelings of comfort and relaxation, even 40 years later. So these triggers can happen both ways, but they tend to be more intense with the more negative experiences, unfortunately. And when people talk about a trauma trigger or an emotional trigger, this is really the link that they are talking about. Now, these links are stronger the more intense the initial experience was, and the more often that happened when, let's say, when you were a child. And then also, the more often it's linked as you're growing up and in your current day life. The more often the link is allowed to happen, not allowed because it's not really allowed, but the more often it happens, the stronger it becomes. And this happens with either the big T or the little t traumas. And preverbal memories also can create these links. And this is really difficult for people who have had preverbal trauma, very early childhood trauma before they were verbal, before they were able to think in a linear fashion. And they may have no memory of the trauma, or they just might have the triggers disrupting their emotional regulation on an ongoing basis. Okay, so that's all really the problem and why the problem happened. But hopefully, it helps you understand that it isn't your fault. Like, this is how we are wired, and this is what happens. And then I do want to show on the screen here the typical cognitive behavioral therapy cycle, which actually has been proven to be very effective. But for people with a lot of these trauma triggers, they don't feel it is. And I just want to explain a little bit why here. So, the typical CBT cycle really says that our feelings are primarily caused by either our behaviors or our thoughts. So it's like how we think about something creates an emotional response, or maybe certain behaviors that we engage in can contribute to either the negative thinking or the negative emotional response. But basically, all these things interact with each other, right? But what happens with somebody who's experienced trauma is that the sensory information comes in whoosh and creates the physical and emotional feelings. So the person who's experiencing that will be like, yeah, my thoughts have nothing to do with this. I was triggered before any thought happened. And that is true. And they also may feel like their behaviors don't matter because they might try to avoid those triggers. They might try to like steel themselves and face the triggers. But no matter what, the emotional response happens. So they end up feeling like this CBT cycle, like, this can't help me. So I agree that the trauma triggers create the emotional response. The other stuff isn't happening, not caused by your conscious thoughts. So you can't really like cure it with your conscious thoughts, right? But let's kind of go through this cycle in a way that might be really helpful for you. So, a key thing to remember here is that you may not be able to stop that initial feeling. Now, I know you want that initial feeling to stop, but bear with me. So the sensory information comes in. You immediately have dysregulated feelings related to a fight, flight, or freeze response. Common responses are a total shutdown, as I mentioned earlier, anger, rage, fear, anxiety, panic. Those all would be typical trauma trigger responses. So let's say you can't stop this, right? Then it's helpful to think through what happens after this happens to you. After this happens, you might go to some kind of behavior which isn't helpful in the long run. Or you might then go down a thought pattern of what is wrong with me? I'm defective. I'll never get over this. So either the unhelpful behaviors, which could be, say, going to drink or eat too much or scream and yell at somebody, right? There's many different behaviors that can come from these feelings that will cause other problems down the line. And then there's many thought patterns that come from this that all then contribute back into the problem. So, what I want to encourage you to do initially is to, if you say, okay, these things are going to hit me, how do I help the cycle end there? What can I do to intervene at that moment without running to the behaviors that are going to make things worse or the thought patterns that will then escalate all the feelings? And I know this isn't the answer you want, but over time, that answer will come. So, a key thing is to understand your cycle, understand what thought patterns, what rabbit hole thoughts you go down after this happens, and what behaviors that don't really serve you and might contribute to the problem, what behaviors do you engage in? So once you understand your cycle, then bringing in this concept of not letting yourself go down those pathways so you can deal with the trigger you're having, but we leave it at that. It doesn't go into the rest of the cycle. And I do have a couple of resources that will help with this, and might as well throw them out right here as I'm talking about it. And then I'm going to come back to what else you can do when you have that trauma trigger when that hits. Okay. So it's been shown that trauma causes a change in self concept and it causes basically negative core beliefs to develop. So knowing your own negative core beliefs is really helpful in terms of identifying when you're going down, spiraling down with those thoughts. And I do have a free PDF on identifying your negative core beliefs, helps you figure out what are your core beliefs. Could be I'm in danger, could be I'm defective, could be I'm unlovable, right? I'm not worthy. A lot of those kind of really deeply seated core beliefs can come from trauma and then they underlie our strong emotional responses. So I'll show the PDF here and put a link in the description, and it also gives you some tools and techniques to begin to rewire those beliefs. And then obviously doing trauma informed therapy and processing the traumatic memories can really help them resolve in a way that those trauma triggers don't create such a strong emotional response. And trauma informed cognitive behavioral therapy can be helpful. Somatic based therapies can be very helpful. And I used to do eye movement desensitization and reprocessing with my clients. And I found that to be the most effective treatment for trauma and also for anxiety. EMDR actually combines the physiological calming techniques with the reprocessing of the memories in a way where you can move in and out of the sort of physiological trauma response back into a sense of safety or calm or at least groundedness in the present. But really, with any of these techniques, bringing in the sense of being here now, grounded in the present, while also talking about the trauma. And then the feelings come up, right? But then you reground. So moving between those states while discussing the trauma helps to move it into long term memory. So it actually can take all of those fragments and turn it more into a story and more into a long term memory where it will be like, okay, I remember that happened, but I'm not re experiencing it. And when you get to the point where you're not re experiencing it, that's probably a point of resolve. So I know that a lot of my viewers don't have access to good therapy or trauma informed therapy. And there is an online resource that can be helpful. It's called Virtual EMDR. I'll show a picture here. I'll put a link below. I am an affiliate because I do know that this program has helped many people, but it's in software that really kind of assists you in doing self guided eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I do have a video on whether doing self administered EMDR is a good idea for you or not, because it's definitely not for everybody. Anyway, I did want to share those resources with you. And then I want to go back to the cycle that we were talking about, because the other thing to do here is to begin to practice grounding techniques and also breathing techniques if those are accessible to you. They're not accessible to a lot of people who have trauma. Grounding techniques can be a little bit easier to access, but breathing is great if that helps you calm down physiologically. But to practice those techniques not in the middle of being triggered. Practice them when you're in a relatively good space, because the more you practice them, the more access you'll have to them, the more you'll be able to pull on them when you do get triggered. So I recommend to people that if they can do the diaphragmatic breathing, that they do it 3 times a day, 5 minutes at a time, every day, regularly. And if the diaphragmatic breathing doesn't work for you, grounding techniques. And I'll post my videos here that I have on these topics, and there's many others you can access. But practicing those regularly is really, really important for people who have a trauma background. And as you strengthen your ability to access those physiologically relaxed, or at least not activated states, right? Then you'll be able to bring it in earlier in this cycle. So when that trauma trigger hits, you'll be able to access some of those grounding techniques. So it's almost like it could be sort of like whoosh, overwhelm. And then a part of your brain will say, grounding. Okay, feet on the floor. I can do a little butterfly tapping. Maybe I can pay attention to my senses, what I'm hearing, what I'm smelling, what I'm feeling. Ground myself in the present moment. And this might not have a huge impact on you initially, but over time, it will have a greater and greater impact on that physiological activation. So again, you may not be able to stop that initial trigger, but you'll be able to calm yourself down more quickly. So I do hope this was helpful. This is a very complicated topic. I hope you can give yourself credit for getting through this video and really putting the effort in to heal, and knowing that this was not your fault, that healing is possible, and being willing to practice and practice and practice. And you can get there. All right. Let me know what questions you have. If you got value out of today's video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed. I'll also link some of my other emotional regulation videos at the end here, and access as much of that and those types of techniques as you can. I wish you health and healing, and I'll see you next week.